We, Commerce, and Senior Executive Coaches Tosco and Penzer. I've had the pleasure of knowing Frank for many years and concluded that Frank is no doubt one of the best observers and analysts of US energy and energy policy, as well as the geopolitics of energy. My pleasure to introduce Frank.
No.
All right, so thank you. It's also my pleasure to be here today. I've known Guy Caruso for 40 years, and Herman as well. We served in the Energy Department together. I was 8 at the time. They were slightly older. And my remit today is to talk about the U.S. role in the world and what that means to policy and how the landscape has changed. And to help me do that, Guy Caruso has already set the stage on the changing energy landscape from the U.S. perspective. And the fact that we've gone from shortage to abundance just in the span of the last 10 years, I'll go through this rather quickly, but that's phenomenal because it's been a reset for us. You know, we thought we were looking at peak oil before, now we're looking at peak demand. So it's not supply, it's a demand issue. We're part of a global market and we're continually reminded about that, even though we seem to forget occasionally, and the SPR is a case in point. And we're now integrating the growth of renewables and electrification. But we're struggling with climate change, as Molly pointed out, and the energy transformation. Adam talked earlier about being with Secretary Clinton in 2008. I was on President Obama's Energy and Climate Change Task Force. We actually won that election. And the notion of that time, in 2006, oil prices were $35 when the senator was running. In 2007, they were $75. And in 2008, the summer of the Democratic Convention, they were $140. So the notion for that administration that the transformation was there, and we needed to do something about that, because Goldman Sachs talked about $250 right around the corner, right? So then we found all this gas, then we found all this oil, then we had Macondo and Fukushima, and things continued to change. On the gas side, I'm getting ahead of myself, but on the gas side, Adam talked about the NPC study. When we did the NPC study on the hard truths and then on prudent development, we looked at the gas for North America, and it was 10,000 trillion cubic feet. So if you spend any time in the industry, this is infinity, and this is 10,000 trillion cubic feet. It's like 200 years of supply, and it's markedly changed the way we look at things. The rise in production, from my perspective in the U.S., it's a story of 3 streams. It's not only oil, and we've doubled our production of oil in the span of 10 years. Gas production is up over 50%, and liquids production, which is the next big issue we're going to have to deal with, is up 116%. And we're now finding that natural gas liquids is actually circumventing the refinery stream and going directly to products. So there's going to be a lot more competition out there. Our exports, because of production and because of policy changes, have also surged. Guy mentioned that we're now exporting more than 4 million barrels a day of refined products, largest in the world. Our exports of crude oil were over 2 at part of the time this year. We've got quality and logistic issues that could curtail that, but we're on a different path. And we've exported now to 30 countries, and the policies change, and we'll see where that goes going forward. That's LNG exports here. LNG exports. When you start looking at, there's 22 countries we've exported LNG to. It was mentioned earlier that not that long ago we were focused on being an importer of natural gas, and we had LNG import facilities. We've turned that around. If the projects that I showed you in the previous slide come to fruition, that the price is right, and the logistics can be carried out in that market, we will be, we're a net exporter now, we could be a large net exporter of natural gas because we've got the resource base. But, and this is the question right now, when we looked at the resource basins in the United States going back 7, 8, 9 years, we found 30 in a number of different states. So politically, and politics we're going to go through, but politically we've been invested with this. But it's coming from places where we haven't had production before. But of those 31 basins, 95% of the oil and gas production over the last 7 years, the big growth, has come from 7. So they're not all the same. They're not all the same geographically, they're not all the same geologically. And what could alter those forecasts? So we frequently talk about over and under performance of the resource. You know, conventional oil has a decline rate of 4 or 5%, unconventionals, we're not sure. The decline rate's been around 50 or 60% after 18 months. What's the ultimate recovery rate? If you frack a well, can you do secondary recovery? Can you do the continuous gas injection that Robert talks about all the time? There's a lot to be done. We've advanced the technology. We're looking at disruptive technologies. And it's not only in the oil and gas sector, but as solar and wind become more economic, people are switching. And as you look at the climate change challenge, what does that fuel base look like in the next 20 to 25 years? Molly talked about the clocks. We have commerciality and economics, energy prices and costs that we look at, the timing and expense of infrastructure build-out. I know later today Kevin Book will be with you, and he talks about a lot about infrastructure. The fact that people now are thinking to challenge infrastructure build of eminent domain for pipelines on the basis of, if it's an export pipeline, what purpose does it serve for the local community? And I firmly believe that you're going to find a judge at some point to agree with that. And we're going to throw that debate into FERC. Public sentiment, license to operate, whether it's upstream or downstream, what does that look like? Geopolitical and catastrophic events, Herman knows that all too well, and policy and regulations is both domestic as well as international. And if I can leave you with one of those thoughts, it's going to be that on the domestic side, and I know Melanie and Kevin and Linda Stunts will talk about that in depth, but it's the international things we do as well. It's foreign policy, it's environmental policy, it's not just, it's tax, it's trade, it's tariffs and sanctions, right? So it's not just energy regulations and rollback, and we'll spend some time on that. On the global side, we see areas of risk and opportunity, but also, as Molly said, lots of uncertainty. We've got a fragile, rebalanced oil market now. We see some economic headwinds. There's people that have come to CSIS in the last year that are talking about a major recession before 2020. So things could change. You saw in the OPEC meeting over the weekend this notion of how much more oil does the market need? Fourth quarter could be pretty tight. First quarter looks pretty sloppy. And if there's sanctions and trade wars, what does that look like to ultimate demand? Do you invest a lot of money to bring production forward when you're not sure you're going to need it and you just worked the last year and a half to reduce the overhang of inventories? Do you want to recreate that surplus in a higher price environment? There's a growing consensus that our climate efforts are totally in action, but we've seen a move away from policy. So policy isn't the be-all, end-all. It's now on a local basis. It's courts, it's banks, and boards. And if you don't think that change is taking place or it's occurring now, you're missing a big bet. The transnational threats of populism, anti-globalization, and radicalization, they're undermining our institutions. What do we use to rebuild the system? We have this debate at CSIS all the time. We have a group of people that are saying, let's just wait out this administration, things to go back to the way they were. I call them the delusional nostalgics. We're never going back to the way we were, but what are we going to build and save as things change? NAFTA, we should review NAFTA. 25 years old. It's time to change and review things because the world situation has changed. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Economic statecraft, and I'm going to talk about this, but sanctions and trade, they're going to continue to reshape our energy markets. Product flows, where refineries are built, where investments are done, what geopolitical alignments look like, big power politics, and proxy wars. This is the future that we're putting energy in. We found 3 C's shaping the energy markets. The first one's competition, right? Oil markets, gas markets, advanced technologies. It's cost, price, and its availability. The second one is consumers. We've got a whole new group of consumers. All the work that Guy and Adam did at EIA and even at the IEA, this notion that the new demand growth is in non-OECD Asia, not the mature economies that we're used to dealing with. They have different priorities, they have different fuel needs, they have different populations. And then crisis, whether they're regional or global, whether it's on fuel, whether it's on nuclear, if it's climate related, cybersecurity and resilience are issues that we have not paid enough attention to. On the energy and sustainable development, if you look at the new policy scenario for the IEA, it talks about a 20 gigaton reduction by 2040 in CO2 output. 100 new nuclear plants is 1 gigaton. Reforesting an area the size of Spain is 1 gigaton. These are daunting tasks, but if you look at your clock, how much more time do we have before we go to just adaptation? And we have to get out of mitigation. So these are the last 3 slides I'm going to really kind of concentrate on. So this is Dr. Brzezinski's slide that I borrowed and added a bottom layer to. It's crisis, big power politics, and proxy wars. Right? We're back to an era that looks a lot like the late 1800s. We're the strongest superpower, but we're no longer the only singular superpower. We've got Russia, as we talked about, being an antagonist with a time clock and causing mischief. And for the amount of investment that Russia has made in Venezuela, in the Middle East, you know, whether it's in Syria, Iran, or Iraq, and now the activity in China, what's our policy to offset that? China clearly is ascending into co-equal status. They're a global power and a rival down the road. How do we engage without conflict? Is that even possible? And what does that look like? Europe, who has been our Atlantic partner with the EU, we have driven a wedge between the United States and Europe. I'm not sure whether you can fix it or what it looks like coming out of this, but can we rebuild that Atlantic alliance? And how do we rebuild it? Because there's a number of different nations that are also heading in different directions. And this is the Syrian flag, and it's just a proxy for what's going on in the Middle East. But we've got region and chaos. And so the questions for these, when we're dealing with a new group of leaders, can they trust each other? Can they work together? And can they work out acceptable arrangements to solve and address the problems in a time frame that really works? And we're not sure. The Trumpian view of the world. This to me is an experiment, right? So President Trump is not necessarily wrong in what he says is the diagnosis for things. Has China been stealing our intellectual property? Absolutely. Do we have trade imbalances with other countries they haven't paid attention to? Absolutely. The problem is his prescription and the remedies he's proposing, people debate whether they're actually the appropriate ones. The peace through strength, we can all believe. This notion that everyone wants to make their country great again. How do you strike trade deals on a better balance for yourself when the other person at the other side of the table wants to do exactly the same thing? There's transactional in natures. He does see opportunity in chaos, but this notion that we're continually negotiating things and nothing ever lands. This really is the great experiment. And the question is, can the application of this new economic statecraft, can it produce economic results and beneficial social results that are constructive? And the jury, quite frankly, is still out. So on sanctions, got North Korea to the table, can we wrap that up in a way that makes sense? We have ambivalence on Russia, the Congress and the White House. Action forcing in Iran, but to what end? And the potential leverage in Venezuela that we've seen, but what is the outcome at the end of the game? On tariffs and trade, we talk about China being a big trading partner. TPP, if you talk to Mike Froman, former trade representative, TPP was designed to get US rules of the road for an Asian area with China not in the game, with the notion that when they participated, the framework would have already been built. We wouldn't be starting from scratch. We are the only ones not in TPP. It makes absolutely no sense. Talked about NAFTA modernization. We've now decided to apply tariffs to enemies as well as friends. So for all the administration has talked about on the regulatory rollback and tax to help US businesses invest more and they're making more profit, what we've done on tariffs and trades and pipelines in Mexico, we were exporting more natural gas and refined products to Mexico that the energy companies were concerned about NAFTA that we'd screw up a good thing. And then we look at competing powers. So China's Belt and Road, they've got agendas of their own. Saudi Vision 2030 that Adam talked about. We talk about US energy dominance. One of the things I would actually argue is that when we were in a scarcity position, environment and energy were more aligned. We were looking at alternatives. We were looking at conservation. Statements a couple of weeks ago is we don't need to conserve anymore. We've got all the energy we need. What does that look like, and where are we going? And now India and China that we have to contend with, and Russia's new role in the Middle East. So I'm going to leave it there so we have time for discussion, because there's ample opportunity to talk about a variety of issues. But pleased to be on this panel and look forward to your questions.
Frank, we didn't disappoint us. As always, you gave an excellent rundown of U.S. energy policy and how things have changed, and a lot of questions about where we are going. The idea was to have some time of a discussion between us, but when I look at the clock, and we don't want to deprive you of your coffee in 10 or 12 minutes, I think it's better to open it up to the floor now, if there are any questions. I have lots of them, but if you have questions, please go to the microphone and mention your name and the company, your organization you work for, and who you are addressing the question to. Yeah, the microphone.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you, and it was a phenomenal panel. I'm Ben Schlesinger, company here with 8 of my students. Please wave. This is our Monday morning class. It's worth it. I'll tell you, it's been phenomenal. My question is for Senator Reyes. You gave a great rundown on Latin America. Latin America is emerging as one of the largest markets for U.S. LNG, exporting LNG. Can you comment on the direction of that in light of the comments that you've made? Do you see this as an increasing market? I ask because I'm really concerned with the potential loss of the China market, and they already have been lost for a lot of the reasons that you all have been discussing this morning. Without the China market, there isn't going to be a second phase of U.S. exports, in my opinion. So the Latin market is America's market is extremely important. Thank you.
Let me start with Mexico. Mexico used to produce about 7 BCFs up to 2010, and since then it has been decreasing its production of natural gas. Now it's producing little under 5, and imports have been growing. It's now over, it's almost 5 BCFs, and they will continue to grow. Now, they are entering via the gas pipelines built in connection with basically Texas and the U.S. But which, by the way, some of them are late. Now, Mexico will need to import LNG in the southern part of the country, because otherwise scarcity will continue in the Yucatan Peninsula and the southern part of the country. There are several projects floating around, but Pemex has not taken the decisions which one to follow in conjunction with private investments. Now we don't know what will be the position of the new administration in regard to that. So, putting it in Mexico, there's a good climate. I mean, for gas, for American gas and LNG. Venezuela is self-sufficient and won't happen, and Brazil. I think things will basically continue the way they are. They are producing gradually more natural gas. So I won't think it will be a significant market for LNG in the near future. So the market is Mexico, and that's what I would suggest.
Argentina, Chile, something.
Well, Colombia is importing more and more, and they are doing it in a fairly efficient way, basically on the Atlantic coast, and I would expect that to continue. There are plans to build further both port facilities to receive the LNG there. So, and Chile, I'm sorry, I'm not sure exactly where the Chilean position is in regard to energy. Yeah.
Good morning. Still is morning, I hope. My name is Malika Saidkhadjaeva and I'm from Uzbekistan. I have questions related to Central Asia. Maybe for last speaker. Do you, plan to update the scenario related to Central Asia energy market? Since last 2 years, the dramatically changes come to the open new market in Central Asia and the big resources, oil and gas, especially in the Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan is wake up very, intensively moving to the new level. So a lot of investors is starting to observing the possibilities to use these energy resources with the very low cost of the production compared to the other part of the markets. So any scenario, any changes in the scenarios of the any research which could be shared with the experts, you can advise, or thank you.
So thank you for the question. So in one of my former incarnations, I was Vice President, Senior VP at Pennzoil when we did the Caspian Baku-Cheghar pipeline and AIOC. The notion of what that region could mean to have a big producing region outside of the Persian Gulf was one of the reasons that the pipelines went west. But we were in a different time, right? So we had the Asian recession, we weren't going to go south, we didn't want to go north back through Russia, so the pipelines all went west or southwest. I think we're in a situation now with Iran, especially in the southern Caspian, having a lot of gas. Turkmenistan has always had the problem of where do you send it to, right? So if the Turkmen in these areas decide that they will do Trans-Caspian and move gas towards Europe, that would make sense, except that I would argue that these areas would have an economic price advantage on that. Kazakhstan still has a Russian problem with old infrastructure. The transportation through China is attractive, but the problem is if you go from that northwest border to the consumption areas on the southeast coastlines, that's a long way to transport gas. So it's a hedge on pricing, but plays into the LNG imports of what China will do as well. You know, the other big piece, I think, is the climate piece. If we're still adding billions of people to the world, if we're going to still put people on coastal areas, we might want to rethink that. So, and I think that's part of the Belt and Road, that the notion that you can do stuff over land instead of putting it through like blue sea transportation and the Arctic and other piece. So I think regionally there's great opportunity, but I think the map is changing.
Additional question related to Afghanistan, and via Afghanistan, the big market like Pakistan and India, which is currently looking for the other option as a scenario, because it's really, the reserve is so huge, and the 4 pipeline already constructed and operated for China, not only for Russia like before, for last 4 or 5 years it was constructed and put on operation, but still reserves, very, very huge compared to our market and with a very low cost. What do you think about this way, Afghanistan or Pakistan via Afghanistan? It will work or not?
So in Afghanistan, there's a number of different problems in Afghanistan before you talk about building major infrastructure. The good news and bad news on pipelines always is that the good news is you can build them from point A to point B, and it's a source of supply, right? Because it's dedicated supply. The bad news is it's dedicated source of supply, because you can't read the pipeline. So this notion of interconnects and other things that need to be done, but we're starting to supplement with other sources of energy. So big scale investments, you need certainty of the governments, you need tax policy, security for investment, and you have to look at what competitors are doing in the region. So this is all going to play out. It's just, we're still in the early days. The resources there.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Next question.
Hello, Sinan Kifol, University of Cambridge. We heard a lot of fearful thoughts about the increasing demand for reaching energy from China, India, other countries in the world. But this is my first time in the United States, and I realized something. The cars are big in this country, the houses are big, even the food portions on the plates they have made. I took a taxi from the airport coming to the hotel, and I asked the driver, can you please open the window? I need some fresh air. And he said, well, let me open the AC. I said, let's not burn energy. We can just manage with the window. He said, well, we have an AC. Why don't we use it? So instead of fearing other countries' demand for energy, do you have any plans or agenda of increasing the consciousness of consumption and energy efficiency? Thank you.
Good morning. Would you like to
I don't think that's on the political agenda in terms of urgency of national concerns.
I can tell you in the neighborhood where I live, the people who live, this is in the part of Maryland, the houses that were built were in the 50s and 60s. And they are somewhere 1,200 to 1,500 square feet. But anybody now who is building it, he tears down those things and put a house at least 3,000 square feet. To put in all the gadgets we bought, we import ad infinitum to store them in that house. And there's 2 people in that house after the kids are gone. But, I don't know. I think this matter of policy. But you want to say anything about that? How we actually? This was such a good question actually, because we're doing everything in the production side. We're taking away all the restrictions on the production side, and the one chance we had is to continue the CAFE standards. We are now changing it so that we will buy more SUVs rather than continuing. It's a very good question because we cannot continue the level of imports that we are doing. Because the President is right on that one. We are importing so much from abroad to maintain this lifestyle and incurring a debt which is now running annually at $800 billion, 2020, $1 trillion a year, financed by 40% of it by foreigners who are putting their money in US treasuries. Now, how long will they continue to do this?
So I think that was my point on where scarcity was putting efficiency, environment, economics, and energy together, and they were directionally in one place. The abundance has diverged the objectives, and we haven't decided how we're going to manage that and what the priorities are.
I think we can have one more question, unfortunately, but I think during the coffee break, I think all 3 of us will be, all 4 of us will be here, so you could ask further questions.
Okay, so I'm Isabella Rubel from the Department of Energy, and my question is, you talked a lot about politics and the radicalizations of government basically around the world. On the one hand, in the Western countries where you see a shift to the right, and then also in more dictatorial systems like China, for example. And you talked about the market, the importance of giving, having a market-based supply. And my question is actually, how do you reconcile the time horizon that you have in Western democracies with a short, basically a short time horizon for each politician that is in power, and versus those countries like China, where basically there's no time limit in the planning.
I think that's a very, very good observation because Mr. Xi, his plan is really over decades to make China great again. We return to I have a beautiful slide that doesn't show it, but it shows economic growth, GDP growth, from the days of Jesus Christ until the latest assessment by the OECD 2060. And when you look at the first 1650 years, India and China together were 50% of global GDP. Then, because the Industrial Revolution, colonialization, India and China came down, and first Western Europe and then America came up. When you look at the next 50 years, you really get a complete reversal again. Not as strong as it was then, but you can see China and India again being somewhere around 40% of the global GDP. Europe, 5%. So we as Europeans, we feel so proud, the great civilization. 5%. America will be still, according to OECD, about 11%. But we don't see this. We have short-term goals, what we want to achieve. But we don't look beyond, and that is why I actually brought this whole thing up. Because China, India, other Asia, that's where the future is for the global economy. Unfortunately, it will have side effects, geopolitical for us, and environmentally for the world.
So two quick things. One, going back to Herman's point, I think after a couple of bad centuries, China and India are back. The second point is on policy. For the last 40 years, I think our policy worked reasonably well, but we're at a great point now, an inflection point where we need to do something else. And my concern is that we're not, even on the SPR, I mean, I agree we ought to be looking at the SPR, the size, composition, disposition, what we put in it, where it goes, right? But the notion of just stopping things and switching, we need to take a longer term perspective and figure out where we are. But the politics are very hard.
I hate to end this session because I think we are having as much fun as I think all of you have. But unfortunately, that has come to an end. We can further discuss it during the private meeting, the coffee break. I just want to remind everybody that the Toyota cars are available for testing outside.